December 22nd, 1944, 11:30 a.m., Bastogne, Belgium. The frozen breath hung in the air as Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kennard watched 4 German officers approach through the snow. Their white flag was stark against the devastated landscape. They carried an ultimatum wrapped in the arrogant confidence of certain victory. "The fortune of war is changing," the message read. "There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town." The German officers waited, supremely confident. They had every reason to be. 18,000 Americans were trapped, surrounded by approximately 30,000 German troops with hundreds of tanks. No supplies could reach them. The weather had grounded all Allied aircraft. The nearest relief forces were over 100 miles away. What they didn't know was that 130 miles to the south, General George S. Patton had just made a promise so audacious that even Eisenhower thought he was joking. A promise that would require moving an entire army through impossible winter conditions faster than any military force had ever moved before. The mathematics of war were about to be rewritten, not by numbers or equipment, but by the collision of German overconfidence with American determination, and by the sheer audacity of a general who refused to believe in the word impossible. The transformation had begun 6 days earlier in the pre-dawn darkness of December 16, 1944. At precisely 5:30 a.m., the Ardennes forest erupted with a violence that hadn't been seen on the Western Front since 1940. 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front, their shells screaming through the frozen air toward unsuspecting American positions. Private First Class Robert Leckie of the 99th Infantry Division would later write, "The earth shook beneath us. The very air seemed to scream. We had been told the Germans were finished. We had been told wrong." This was Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's last desperate gamble to reverse the tide of war. In absolute secrecy, the Wehrmacht had assembled over 410,000 troops and 1,400 tanks, moving this massive force through the dense Eifel forests, often using horses to move supplies to maintain radio silence. Generalmajor Heinz Kokott, commanding the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, noted that the soldiers knew what was at stake. This was their last chance. The Germans achieved complete tactical surprise against 4 thinly spread American divisions. But the German plan had one critical, non-negotiable requirement: speed. They needed to capture the vital road junction at Bastogne within 48 hours. 7 major roads converged there, roads German tanks needed to reach their ultimate objective, the port of Antwerp, 125 miles away. Without Bastogne, the entire offensive would stall. Racing toward the same objective from the opposite direction was the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. They had been resting in Reims, France, recovering from heavy combat when the emergency call came. With no time to gather winter clothing or prepare, they grabbed their weapons and loaded onto trucks. By 9 p.m. on December 17th, the temperature had dropped to a dangerous 14 degrees Fahrenheit as the first trucks carrying the 101st Airborne rolled through the darkness toward Bastogne. Private First Class Donald Burgett of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment remembered passing endless columns of American troops heading the opposite direction, retreating, shouting, go back, they'll kill you all." The 101st kept moving. Their convoy stretched for miles as 380 trucks drove through the night. Leading elements of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment reached Bastogne at 11:30 p.m. on December 18th. They had beaten the main German force by just hours. Team Desobry, a combat team from the 10th Armored Division, commanded by Major William D. Sobry, had already established a crucial roadblock 3 miles north of Bastogne. At dawn on December 19th, Sergeant William McCloskey, a tank commander, faced the entire 2nd Panzer Division. His 75mm rounds bounced harmlessly off the frontal armor of the German Panther tanks.
Decobre's small force, with just 15 Sherman tanks, held for 48 hours, destroying 31 German tanks before being overrun. That sacrifice had bought the 101st the precious time it needed to consolidate the perimeter. By noon on December 20th, the last road into Bastogne was cut. Captain Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, positioned his men in foxholes. They could hear German tanks moving in the darkness beyond their lines. The temperature was near zero. Men's feet were already turning black from frostbite as they dug their foxholes deeper into the frozen ground, sometimes breaking entrenching tools or using bare hands. The town's 3,000 civilians huddled in cellars as German artillery began systematically destroying the town. The defenders of Bastogne, a mix of paratroopers, armor, and the all-African-American 969th Artillery Battalion, were now completely surrounded, numbering approximately 18,000 men. Ammunition was running dangerously low. Artillery was rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day, and food dwindled to 1 meal. Medical supplies were exhausted, with morphine reserved only for the most severe casualties. Private First Class James Sims of the 101st later recalled, "We were eating snow for water. My buddy next to me in the foxhole had his feet frozen to his boots. When the medic finally cut them off, his toes came off with them. He didn't even cry." 130 miles south of Bastogne at Verdun, Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower called an emergency conference of his senior commanders on December 19th. The mood was grim. Eisenhower broke the silence by declaring, "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster." Lieutenant General George S. Patton immediately grinned. Eisenhower turned to him. "George, I need you to attack north. How quickly can you disengage from your current offensive and pivot toward Bastogne?" Moving an entire corps 90 degrees across 100 miles of icy roads in 48 hours was by all military standards impossible. But Patton had already prepared for exactly this contingency. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours, he replied calmly. The room was stunned. Patton had already issued preliminary orders. "I'm not being fatuous, Ike. I've already issued preliminary orders." Eisenhower set the deadline. December 22nd morning, do it. Patton immediately called his headquarters with the prearranged code word, "Play ball." Those 2 words initiated one of the most remarkable operational maneuvers in military history. 133,000 vehicles began moving north. The entire Third Army, 250,000 men, had to be reoriented. Logistical units worked frantically, moving 20,000 miles of telephone wire and relocating supply dumps. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 26th Tank Battalion of 4th Armored Division, received orders to move 150 miles in 19 hours through a blizzard. They drove with blackout lights through the night. Tank commanders stood in their turrets, freezing, guiding drivers who couldn't see the road.
Back in Bastogne, the perimeter was shrinking fast. German artillery had every strong point ranged. At 11:30 a.m. on December 22nd, when the 4 German officers under the white flag presented their surrender ultimatum, General McAuliffe was catching a brief nap in his basement headquarters. When his chief of staff explained that the Germans had come to take their surrender, McAuliffe's immediate instinctive response was, "Nuts." After his staff suggested that his first word was indeed the best possible reply, McAuliffe penned the legendary response, "To the German commander, nuts. The American commander." When Colonel Joseph Harper delivered the message, the German officers were confused. "Nuts? What does this mean?" Harper explained simply, "It means, go to hell." General Hasso von Manteuffel, the German commander, was surprised the ultimatum was even sent. The German reaction to the defiance was swift. That evening, the Luftwaffe launched its first major bombing raid on Bastogne, and the artillery barrages intensified. The temperature plummeted to near 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Men took turns sleeping to prevent freezing to death. Food was desperate, and Technical Sergeant Donald Malarkey found that the thousands of dead, frozen German horses provided the only available fresh meat. They hacked off chunks with bayonets and cooked them over fires made from broken ammunition boxes. It was a terrible meal, but it kept them alive. December 24th brought both tragedy and a miracle. The weather had finally begun to clear, raising hopes for aerial resupply, but it also enabled the Luftwaffe to launch a devastating raid that killed 30 American soldiers and the heroic Belgian nurse Renee Lemaire. As Christmas Eve turned to Christmas Day, Patton's Third Army was fighting through the final defensive lines. Patton, convinced only God could fix the weather, had asked his chaplain to publish a prayer for good weather days earlier. Whether by divine intervention or luck, December 23rd dawned crystal clear. The weather break was miraculous. The sky, finally free of fog, was immediately filled with 241 C-47 transport planes dropping colored smoke and then supplies. The paratroopers erupted in cheers, running through artillery fire to grab bundles containing ammunition, medical supplies, and food. At 2:45 a.m. on Christmas morning, a massive German barrage was followed by an attack by 18 Panzer Mark V tanks. The tanks broke through the first line of foxholes, but the M18 Hellcats of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion had been hidden in rubbled buildings. As the German tanks passed, the Hellcats opened fire from the flanks. Sergeant Bill Harper recalled, "We let them roll past, then hit them in the ass where the armor was thin." By 10 a.m., all 18 German tanks were burning wrecks, and the infantry attack was repulsed. December 26th, 4 p.m. Lieutenant Charles Bulge, commanding Sherman Tank Cobra King of the 37th Tank Battalion, was just 4 miles from Bastogne. The 4th Armored Division had been fighting without rest for 4 days. The final assault was launched under a massive artillery barrage. At 4:50 p.m., Cobra King crested a small rise, and Bulge saw American soldiers ahead. They were engineers of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, the outer perimeter of Bastogne's defenses. "Come on in," shouted the engineers. "You're the first tanks we've seen in 10 days." Bulge radioed Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. Contact with friendly forces established. The siege was broken. The news of the breakthrough was electric. Men who had rationed every round of ammunition fired entire cliques into the air in celebration. General McAuliffe simply said, "We're glad to see you, boys." For the Germans, the psychological impact was devastating. General Major Kokot wrote, "The relief of Bastogne is a disaster, not just tactically, but morally." Oberlieutenant Kaufmann of the Panzer Lehr Division was more blunt. "We threw everything we had at Bastogne, and for what? They held, and when we demanded their surrender, they laughed at us. Nuts." This single word did more damage to German morale than 1,000 bombs. German losses around Bastogne were catastrophic, exhausting Germany's last reserves of men and equipment and clearing the path for the Soviet advance on the Eastern Front. The defense of Bastogne and Patton's lightning relief cemented a powerful truth. On a quiet hill outside Bastogne stands a foxhole preserved exactly as it was. A plaque bears the simple inscription, words spoken by a young paratrooper whose name is lost to history. "They've got us surrounded, the poor bastards." That magnificent defiance, that refusal to accept defeat, was the spirit that brought Patton's tanks roaring through the snow. When freedom itself hung in the balance, they answered with a word that echoes through eternity: nuts. The German mockery died in the snow around Bastogne, buried beneath the thunder of Patton's tanks and the incomparable spirit of the surrounded paratroopers.